Sean?
Yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm gonna hit you. Okay?
You're gonna hit me.
People achieving all the successes that the society has to offer and being miserable. Human beings have certain needs. You deprive people of those needs, they're gonna suffer. This society simply fails to provide for those needs of children, so it's toxic. A lot of people with ADHD or bipolar disorder or depression or addictions, very talented, creative, wonderful people. But that's not because of their condition. It's because of what underlies their condition. And what underlies their condition is the only thing that's genetic, which is sensitivity. The average psychiatrist these days has no training in trauma. When somebody gets stabilized in psychiatric medications, that's when the work should begin. But the problem is that's when it ends. There's good news in all this. Healing is available. It's just inside all of us. The biggest work is the work that we do on ourselves. Well, there's your true self.
Welcome. Look at all these faces. So beautiful. When I look at all these faces, I think to myself, humanity is going to be all right. We got some shiny humans up in the building. Thank you so much. I have so much gratitude for everybody who showed up today. And the invitation before we begin is to listen with our whole being. I think that oftentimes we can undervalue the power of one insight, one nugget, what that can do to transform our lives. And if we can all be present in our bodies, listen with our hearts, who knows what can happen on the other side of that. So let's get things rolling. Welcome back to the Know Thyself Podcast live, where I am very excited to create a series ongoing where we are going to be bringing elders and wisdom holders and community to have a live experience where we can allow community to ask questions and bring conversations of awakening at a bigger and bigger scale. My guest today is somebody that I've admired and love his work for a long time. He is a world-renowned speaker, best-selling author, and is an expert on various range of topics from addiction, stress, to childhood development. He is somebody that has written multiple best-selling books, such as When the Body Says No, Scattered Minds, and In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. He is somebody that has a profound understanding of what we're going to be diving into today, which is his new book called The Myth of Normal. It's trauma, illness, and healing in a toxic culture. And it's a very timely subject, I believe, for the planet right now and for everybody that's listening, because these messages of awakening and understanding holistically where we've gotten to as a species and the insight that this individual can bring today, I think is very important and very timely. So without further ado, Dr. Gabor Maté, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for just sitting through all that. Well, it's been such a pleasure to have you here, and I would just love to lay some groundwork before we dive deep. And so to kind of start wide, and then we can dive into some of these different topics, could you give a basic understanding of how you define trauma? Because that is a word that is used a lot in culture nowadays and can be misconstrued. So how do you define trauma? And we can go from there.
Sure. Well, let me say first of all what it isn't. Because as I've often said now, it's a word that's used too loosely. On the one hand, it's not used enough, not nearly enough. Where it matters, it's not used at all. In medicine, it's not used at all. The average doctor doesn't get a single lecture on trauma, which is amazing. When you do all the research that's been shown to connect trauma and adult illness of mind and body, whether it's cancer or depression or addiction, so much research, but in the average medical school doesn't hear a single lecture on trauma. Unbelievable, but true. It's not used in law. Everybody's sitting in death row in this country with traumatized children. All of them, without exception. And the average lawyer does not get a single lecture on trauma, not one. In the schools, all the kids that are considered to be bullies or troubled kids or kids with ADHD or aggression, learning difficulties, it's all about trauma. And the average educator doesn't get a single lecture on trauma. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we use the word a bit too loosely. You know, like I went on a picnic on Sunday and it rained and I was traumatized. No, you weren't. You were just rained on, you know. Or I saw this movie last night and I was traumatized. No, you weren't. You were just upset. Or somebody stood me up on a date and I was traumatized. No, you weren't. You were just disappointed. So trauma isn't stress, it isn't upset, isn't even pain. Trauma is a wound. In fact, that's what the word means. It comes from a Greek word for wound. So trauma is a wound that you sustain, which then shows up later on in your life. Unhealed, it shows up in your physiology, it shows up in your thinking, in your relationships, in how you feel about yourself, in how you handle your emotions. So trauma basically is a wound, and there's a good colleague of mine in the room, Larry Heller, who himself has a particular therapeutic approach, and he and I both agree that trauma is not what happens to you. It's not the terrible things that happen to you, such as, you know, obvious ones, such as abuse or neglect. It's the wound that you sustain inside. So trauma is not that somebody hits you on the head. It's the concussion with the long-term effects. So basically, trauma is a wound that shows up later on in life in all aspects of your existence. And there are degrees of it, the different... let me just say quickly also that you can wound people by two ways. Young children, you can wound them two ways. You can do bad things to them, and that happens a lot more than we like to recognize. But you can also wound kids not by doing bad things to them, but by not giving them their needs, not giving them what they need. So depriving somebody of their need is a way of hurting them. And human beings have certain emotional needs. So a lot of children, it's not that people do bad things to them, it's that they don't know how to meet their needs. And those kids are wounded as well. So it's a wound.
Amazing. And you also give a distinction between capital T, big T, little t trauma, because a lot of people are familiarized with the overt, big, cataclysmic events that happen in people's childhood or in life. But can you give that distinction? I think so.
Well, the distinction really is how the trauma is sustained. So the capital T are the ones easy to recognize. So there's the very famous, not famous enough, but very famous adverse childhood experiences studies, the AC studies that were done here in California with 17,000 adults. And what they looked at is certain experiences in childhood, what they call adverse childhood experiences, and adult outcomes. So an adverse childhood experience was physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, that's 3, neglect, a parent dying, a parent being jailed, a parent being mentally ill, a parent being addicted, violence in the family, a divorce, 10. And you get a point for each. Now, the more points you accrue, the greater the outcome in adulthood. So for example, with addiction, a male child with 6 of these, their risk of addiction doesn't go up 6-fold, it goes up 46-fold. So that these multiply each other. So these are the adverse childhood experiences, very famous, not famous enough, I can talk about that, but famous. These are the big T traumas, things that you can identify. More confusing and more difficult to reckon with are what some people, including myself, call the small T trauma, which isn't the bad things that happened, but the good things that didn't happen that should have. So children are born with certain needs. Now it's clear to you that if I don't feed an infant, they're going to be hurt. I'm not doing anything to them, but I'm also not giving them what they need. Human children and human infants, human beings also have certain emotional needs, and depriving them of those needs is traumatizing. So a child not getting the attention they need, the love they need, the acceptance they need, being seen, being heard, being given the freedom to experience all their emotions, whatever they happen to be. Certain other needs, if they're not met, they're also wounded. And that's what I call the small t traumas. These little things that when you ask people, by the way, we can do this experiment here in this room if there's anybody brave enough. I had this really happy childhood. And then but I still got addicted, or I had autoimmune disease, or I had depression, or I had malignancy, or I had anxiety, or I have ADHD. But I had a happy childhood. And then I issue what I call the Happy Childhood Challenge, which is give me 3 minutes. And we'll see how. So if there's anybody here that had a really happy childhood, they want to find out just how miserable it really was. Feel free to volunteer. It's always a learning experience. So anyway, that's the small t of the needs not being met.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful distinction, because oftentimes we're not aware of what we didn't get, like the nutrients we didn't get as a kid, but that ultimately contributes to the constitution that we develop. You give this interesting distinction because also, like, looking from the wide scope of things, there's the trauma we incur in our life, big and little t, and then also how the toxic culture in which we live, especially in modern society, very much so undermines the needs. And you give this distinction in the book, which, by the way, is a behemoth of a book, but I loved every page of it, all 500 of them.
Yeah. Well, believe me, when we first finished the manuscript, it was double this length.
Wow.
Yeah, it was. I didn't know what not to say, Wow.
It's a lot to say. There's a lot to say about the ways in which culture has become toxic, and also the word toxic has become used so often. And so giving your definition of that, and the assumptions that we make about our human needs, because the assumptions that we make, you've given in the book you shared, that making assumptions about human beings in a toxic culture is like making an assumption about an elephant in a zoo, far divorced from its natural origins.
Right.
And so if you could just explain, what are our actual true human needs and how does culture undermine them? Sure.
So there's a podcaster and writer called Tom Hartman, his name is, and in one of his books, he said that a culture can be nurturing or toxic. The analogy, actually, for me as a physician, comes from laboratory science. If you're in a laboratory, you're growing organisms, microorganisms, and you put them in a dish called a Petri dish, and you give them a certain broth. And your intention is to have these organisms proliferate and grow properly. And if they do, then it's a nurturing culture. But if large numbers of them got sick or died off or didn't reproduce or were dysfunctional, you'd say it's a toxic culture. So how to judge whether a culture is toxic or nutritious or nourishing is how are the organisms in that culture thriving, or how are they suffering? Now, if you look at this society, and I could go through the statistics, there's a lot of suffering. People, it's all this wealth, but I don't know if I have to prove it to you. There's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of people hurting each other, people hurting themselves, people being hurt, people achieving all the successes that the society has to offer and being miserable despite the successes, or perhaps because of the successes. So that's what makes it toxic for me. Now, if a culture meets the needs of the organisms, in other words, then it's a nutritious and nourishing culture. If it doesn't, it's a toxic one. Human beings have certain needs, which are very different than the assumptions that are basic to corporate capitalism. Because the assumption in this system is that people are selfish, that they're greedy, that they're aggressive, that they're competitive, and that they're individualistically against their fellow human beings, and that's how you succeed. Well, human beings actually, if you look at it from the point of view of human needs, it's very different. How did we evolve as creatures? We evolved for millions of years and hundreds of thousands of years. And even our own species, Homo sapiens sapien, we've been on the earth for 200,000 years. For 95% of that time, we lived in small band hunter-gatherer groups where we're together with our families the whole day, where the kids spent the whole time around the parents, when people had to cooperate in order to survive, where wealth wasn't defined by what you achieved, but by what you gave away, where collaboration was necessary. And this was not the case until a blink of an eye ago. So in other words, our needs as defined by our evolution are for community, they're for contact, they're for collaboration, they're for connection, which translates into giving and receiving love and giving and receiving care. Children are born with certain essential needs. I've mentioned some of them. They have a need to belong in an attachment relationship where they feel absolutely safe and secure. Inside that relationship, they have to be free from having to work, which means the child shouldn't have to work to make the relationship work. They shouldn't have to be good, pretty, compliant, smart. They should just be. No work to be accepted. That's their second need. Rest from having to work to make their relationship work. The third essential need of the child is to be able to experience all their emotions, which means all the emotions that our brains are wired with by evolution, which include connection and love, playfulness, curiosity, but they also include rage, anger, and grief, and fear. And children should have the freedom to experience all that without being told that such and such an emotion is not acceptable. And we have the need for free, spontaneous play out in nature. That's a human need that we share with all other mammals. And play is much more important for brain development than school is, actually. I don't mean play with this, by the way. I mean spontaneous creative play. Okay, those are the needs of children. As adults, we have the need for connection and belonging, for meaning, and for purpose in our lives. These are needs. You deprive people of those needs, they're going to suffer. This overdose crisis in the United States, last year, over 100,000 people died of overdoses in the US. Do you know that more people died in 1 year of overdoses than American soldiers who died in the Vietnam, Afghan, and Iraq wars put together? Why did these people die? If you actually look at, they've been called deaths of despair. A lot of them were people that, where there used to be industry, there used to be a sense of community, meaningful connection, meaningful activity. Due to globalized corporate capitalism, all that got hollowed out. People lost their sense of community, their sense of belonging, and their sense of meaning and purpose. One of the responses to that is addiction. So that's how important these needs are. And this society simply fails to provide for those needs of children or for adults. So it's toxic. That's not too heavy duty for you, but that's my diagnosis.
That's, I mean, in the book, you give the plethora of examples in which culture is toxic in the various many industries, from food to social political systems to definitely the pharmaceutical industry, and how the toxicity, the toxic tentacles have reached into every corner of culture nowadays. Before we dive deeper into that, I feel like it's important to get context as to where is home within ourselves. What is a true self without trauma? What is a true self without wounding? And because that's the place we're walking back towards. And so in your understanding, what is that self like? What are the qualities of that essence, so we can have a reference point of what we're walking towards?
Well, let me give you an example. Well, actually, I'll give you two examples. One is I was on the Joe Rogan podcast back in September. It's the first time I met the guy. And he was telling me that and you probably know this, he was a martial arts champion, I think in Taekwondo perhaps. Very aggressive. Losing was anathema to him. He just couldn't stand the idea of losing. He was aggressive. He was rough in his personal life. And whatever you think of him now and his positions and political opinions, he's gone through quite a transformation. And he's much more open about his emotions, much more willing to be vulnerable, not to be hostile. And I just asked him, in which state did you feel more like yourself? And he says, in this one. Well, what does that tell me? Or I can ask you, any of you, if you're like me, you've done plenty of things that are selfish and manipulative and aggressive, perhaps. And you've also perhaps been at times kind and generous and open-hearted. Now, if you ask yourself, when do you feel more ease inside yourself? When is your whole nervous system and all your viscera and your body more at home with itself? Or as opposed to tense and on edge? Is it when you've done something selfish and self-serving and greedy and grasping and mean? Or is it when you've done something generous and giving and open-hearted? Well, most people will say, I feel more myself and more at ease when I'm open. That tells you what the true nature is. So it's not a theoretical question. Just look at your own experience. When do you feel more like yourself? And there's your answer.
Yeah.
So, all the spiritual teachers tell us from ancient Hindu times, the Buddha, even before the Buddha, the rishis, there's the true self, the one that's aware and conscious and open-hearted and loving and so on. And all the spiritual teachings will tell you that. But you don't have to go to the spiritual teachings. Just look at your own experience. And by the way, why are you even here? Why are you here? Why do you want to hear this stuff? I mean, not that you shouldn't, but why do you want to hear this stuff? Or who is it in you that wants to hear it? Or who is it in you that wants to contribute? Well, there's your true self.
When we come into the world first, like we just are who we are, right? And then we pick up all this wounding and trauma. And on the process of developing as a child, we oftentimes forsake our true selves in the pursuit of safety, in our perceived safety at the time, in unconscious ways that we can't, rationalize.
Well, that's when the child has to work for safety.
Right.
If the safety is not there, then the child has to create it. And that's where you're heading, I think.
Yeah, so I would just love for you to dive into the process of how we kind of unconsciously abandon our true selves in the pursuit of safety as a child, because that, I think, really informs us to see how we might still be doing it, but then also why we've gotten to the place we have individually and collectively.
Yeah. So in the book, there's a chapter called Authenticity versus Attachment. So attachment is just a need to belong. I've talked about that. The child needs to belong to caregivers who will look after them. That's clearly, mammals are creatures of attachment. That dog is a creature of attachment. That dog wants to belong.
That dog is definitely a creature of attachment.
So,
I lived with it.
And even birds, little birds, they don't survive without somebody looking after them. So attachment is just a drive that's instinctively and genetically programmed into us. We have to connect, we have to belong. And so attachment is a drive that pulls two bodies together for the sake of taking care of, or for the sake of being taken care of. Not negotiable. But we have another need, which is what I call authenticity. And auto, the self, auto means self, automobile. We have this need to be ourselves. Now, on the most basic level, Why do we even need to be ourselves? What I mean by that is we have to be connected to our bodies and our emotions and to be able to heed their guidance. Why? Well, we evolved out there in nature. Just how long do you survive out there in nature? How long does any creature survive in nature if they're not connected to their gut feelings? Not very long. So we have this need for authenticity, being connected to ourselves, being able to heed our inner GPS, as it were. And we have this need to attach, authenticity and attachment. By the way, let's just do a little test that I do with audiences. So just if you've had the following experience, that at some point you had a strong gut feeling about something and you ignored it and you felt sorry afterwards, just raise your hand, okay? Everybody, right? You know the story you just told? You told the story of your childhood. Have you ever met a one-day-old baby that ignores their gut feelings? Never. Something happened. And what happened is this. You have your gut feelings, you have your authentic emotions, but at some point, you got the message, if you want to belong, you better give that up. It's that simple. Now, how does that work? Well, to mention another famous Canadian, much more famous than I am, Jordan Peterson, okay? So Jordan Peterson writes a book called 12 Rules for Life, in which millions of copies are in the world. And he advises that an angry child should be made to go sit by themselves until, quote, they come back to normal. Okay? So you get this angry 2-year-old. Why is the 2-year-old angry? Because you frustrated him. And if you're a good parent, you're going to frustrate your 2-year-old. And I don't mean deliberately. I just mean when they want a cookie before dinner, you're not going to give them a cookie. You're going to say, no cookie before dinner. Well, if he's a healthy 2-year-old, they're going to throw a tantrum because they're frustrated. No, I want a cookie. But then you read Jordan Peterson's book. And he says, an angry child should be made to sit by themselves till they come back to normal. It's not normal for a kid to be angry. So the kid gets the message. If I'm going to experience my genuine self, I'm going to lose my attachment. Now guess what the kid's going to give up? The attachment or the authenticity? But only 100% of the time. It's the authenticity. Because without the attachment, they can't live. But then, authenticity becomes the threat. So the kid becomes afraid of their true selves. Because if I'm being myself, they won't like me. They'll reject me. They'll even hurt me. I can give you a worse example. A kid who's being abused. The natural reaction is to want to run away or to fight back. Can they afford to? What would happen if they did? So they have to push it down. They literally have to separate from themselves in order to survive. So this is where and then of course, the culture rewards you. Oh, you're such a good kid. You're always compliant. You're always so nice. You're always so pleasant. Come here, let me pat you on the head. What a pretty little girl, always pretty, you know. In other words, we praise kids for pleasing us. So the reward is the attachment. And we don't care about the child's inner experience. So then we give ourselves up just in order to be accepted. So it's that simple. And by the show of hands, you can see how widespread it is. It's just endemic. And then you grow up and you're 30 or 40 and you're 50 saying, who the hell am I anyway? And whose life am I living? And why am I behaving in these ways?
Yeah, that process of excavating and discovering why we are the way we are, why our neuroses are present, what our behavior is fascinating. And I want to dive a little bit deeper here because in the book you share this story of this time where something happened between you and your wife, and you ended up giving her the silent treatment. Yeah, and it comes back to this point where you said, even though you could say that you giving her the silent treatment was a reenactment, I guess, from behavior of trauma that you incurred, being born during World War II.
Yeah.
And there comes a point when the story you're saying Hitler made me do it won't cut it anymore.
Yeah.
And so the question is, for whatever reason our neuroses are here, they're here. How do you suggest others take conscious responsibility for unconscious behavior? How can you accurately take conscious responsibility for something that you're unaware of, right?
Well, I've had plenty of that. And when you're caught up in the coils of unconscious behavior, you don't know that. You're just behaving. You may even think you know why you're behaving that way, but you don't really. In my marriage, my default setting is withdrawal. I'm out of here, I've been married 53 years. But when something goes wrong, I'm still thinking, am I in the right marriage, Maybe I should get out of here, That's my default setting, and there's reason for that in my early programming. When you're caught up in it, you don't know it, but you sure get the impact. At a certain point, you have to start asking yourself, why am I behaving this way? That'll never yield any answers. Because why am I behaving this way is not a question, it's an accusation. But if you say, well, why am I behaving this way? Oh, well, obviously, there's something I'm not aware of. So what I'm saying here, Andre, is that quest or that process of inquiry, of doing that archaeology of the mind, of what's actually driving me, it usually starts because there's some impacts that keep recurring that just aren't working very well. So that can show up in the form of relationship problems. They often do. And you can keep doing what you're doing and get into 300 different relationships and still wonder, why does this keep happening to me? Or you can start asking yourself, maybe I'm doing something here. Just maybe, So usually it begins with some suffering, physical disease, autoimmune illness, malignancy, depression, anxiety, addiction, recurrent relationship issues, job failures. At a certain point, something twigs that maybe I can take some responsibility here. Not blame, but responsibility. So that's where it begins. So first you don't know, Andre. You just see the impact. But then the more you do the work, the more you actually start becoming aware of the pattern as it arises. So you can actually start noticing. And you're a meditator. And one of the things people do in meditation, I don't know what type you do, but one of the things people do in some meditations is just to be aware of their minds, of all the thoughts and emotions, impulses that arise, but to observe it impartially. So at a certain point, you have to start looking at yourself. And usually we are dragged kicking and screaming by our own suffering into that inquiry.
Yeah. And I love that invitation that you gave of when you become aware, oftentimes because of our conditioning, we want to become the prosecutor of our own experience instead of just becoming curious and saying, why is that there? And like you spoke to bring that self-compassion to yourself and that it's okay. And you can hold yourself in a way that maybe your parents or, your friends never did. And in that place, we can then take that conscious responsibility of our experience and bring what's, as Jung says, like make the unconscious conscious.
Yeah, Larry, who was sitting right there, and I, and any therapist worth their salt, will not work on behaviors or dysfunctional patterns, but on the internal dynamics that drive them, number one. And number two, help the person develop the inner safety where they can examine themselves without beating themselves up. And so from that point of view, there's no part of us, the most hateful part, the parts most filled with hatred, the parts that are addicted, the parts that are even full of self-loathing, they all deserve compassion. They all deserve to be held and understood. And they all came along for a reason. Even that self-loathing came along for a reason. But even that self-loathing part has a function. It didn't come, it's not an enemy. I could go into what that function is, but this voice that keeps beating you up, I'm such a bad person, it's actually came along to help you in the first place.
Yeah, how? I'd be
How?
curious.
Well, let's say a child is not getting their needs met. Or worse, they're getting hurt. Now, the child can make two unconscious assumptions. Only two. One is, this is a terrible world. I'm all alone. Everybody's against me. My parents don't know how to love me, or they're incompetent. We're talking about 2 or 3, 4-year-old child. 5-year-old child. Well, the child can assume there's something wrong with me. It's all my fault. And if I work hard enough, maybe I can fix it. Now, which is the safer assumption for it? Which is the one they can live with?
The one where they forsake their authenticity, like you spoke to earlier.
Well, the one that says that maybe it's my fault and I can do something about it.
Yeah.
If I work hard enough, maybe I can make myself loved. Maybe I can correct it. If I keep beating myself up hard enough, maybe I can make myself okay. To assume that the world is that dangerous is just unbearable for the child. So even that self-loathing comes along as it's also turning the anger towards the adults against yourself, which is a lot safer. It's not very safe to be angry with your parents all the time when you're 2 years old. You know?
I'm curious, when that happens and there's that self-loathing or anger that turns inwards, how do you advise people to move through that? How can they hold themselves? How can they work with that so it doesn't rule them?
There's a number of ways to work with it. One is to talk to that part and say, what are you trying to do? Not what are you trying to do, but what are you trying to do? And that part will usually say, I'm just trying to make sure that he behaves or she behaves or they behave so that they will be accepted by their environment. Basically, you make friends with that part. How I work with it, sometimes that's one way I work with it sometimes. Another way I work with it sometimes is just feel that part, that loathing. Are you familiar with that at all? Have you ever had that sense?
Mm-hmm.
Is it just an idea or does it have a bodily manifestation?
Bodily manifestation.
Yeah. Then I'll ask you to, is it okay if we just allow it to be here for now?
Yeah.
Can you and I just be with it? So you actually learn to hold it rather than just to run away with it from it, you know? So there's ways of working.
Yeah. To invite it to the dinner table. Like
I invite them to the table, invite them to be there.
All the emotions.
Yeah.
So good. So good. How, in this process of curing these, these traumatic experiences in our life, what is the differentiating factor? You said it's not what happens to us, but what happens within us. What is the difference if like two siblings are raised in the same household and they're
not?
They're not. Okay, so there you go. But like one is crippled by the experience in which they were raised, the other one, thrives. So,
so first of all, no two children have the same parents, and no two children have the same family, and no two children have the same set of experiences. And I've seen this even in identical twins brought up by their birth mother. They did not have the same mother. I delivered these kids myself. Well, the mother did, but I was there, One of them came out 5 minutes earlier and was a pound or two bigger. The mother always had a sense of kind of guilt and anxiety about the second one, about somehow that the second twin kind of lost out in uterus. was muscled aside by the bigger one. So she always had more concern and more worry in her voice and in her look when she talked to or about that kid. With the bigger one, the first one, she was much more confident and robust. They didn't have the same mother. And so no two children, one of them is, no, in the average family, but without identical twins. One kid is born earlier, the other born later. The parents in a different relationship with each other. They might be more or less stressed. Their relationship might be better or worse. Their economic situation might be better or worse. Each child triggers something different in the parent. Not because the parent necessarily wants to favor one child over the other, just because they bring up different aspects of ourselves. So there's all kinds of reasons why no two children have the same experiences. So there's no comparing experiences. So why does somebody come along as looking more dysfunctional than the other one? All kinds of reasons. And even in a family where some children are abused, not necessarily all children are abused. The perpetrator always knows who's vulnerable and who isn't. So that in families where there's abuse, there's sometimes tremendous breakdown amongst the adult children who simply cannot believe what the other is saying about the family. They had a totally different experience. And finally, temperament. Winnicott, who's a British psychiatrist, he said that even if a mother could be the same mother to all eight of her children, which she couldn't be, but even if she could be, they'd still have 8 different mothers because they're born with different temperaments. So they experience the mother. If you're more sensitive, you're going to have a different set of experiences. So there's no similarity of experience.
Yeah. Now, to present day, like as adults, how important is it that we actually try to pinpoint what the experience was that led to something? Or is it just important to feel what's present and not necessarily know the story of how it happened?
Well, if you go back to that point of view about trauma, that trauma is not what happened to you, what happened inside you, then it's what's happening inside you now. That's what matters. So what happened doesn't matter so much. It's what are you carrying now? I don't have a hell of a difficult time figuring out what happened to somebody after I spent 10 minutes in conversation, because it shows up in how they talk about themselves and their narrative and how they hold their bodies, the choice of words they use, the tone of voice they speak, the facial expression. So it's usually not that difficult to trace it. It's helpful to know, but it's not 100% crucial to know the exactly what happened part.
Yeah.
It's what am I carrying now?
So like I alluded to earlier, Young, saying that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule you and you will call it fate.
Yeah.
When we're at this point now where we can take responsibility for whatever is going on in our lives, whatever neuroses that we have, whatever unconscious behavior that we want to slide under the rug, but people keep reflecting back to us as, that person's always that kind of way. That's just how they are. It's not who they are. It's it's what they've accumulated that's gotten them to that point. So what is the most effective way you found to make the unconscious conscious in that process? Like, are there certain modalities on the path to healing and wholeness? What has actually led to true transformation in what you've seen?
This may be the toughest question you've asked me so far, because I don't think there's any one simple answer. It's not that difficult to make the conscious conscious. St. Paul said at one point that when you shine a light into the darkness becomes light itself. Darkness is not an entity, and there's no such thing as darkness, actually. There's such a thing as light. There's light waves, but there's no darkness waves. Darkness is just the absence of light. So once you shine light on something, it becomes clear. So there's a whole lot of ways of shining light on the unconscious. Certainly meditation is one of them. Although I think by itself, it's got limitations. Body work, because our bodies reflect our beliefs about ourselves. Various forms of psychotherapy. Sometimes somebody will say a word to me and I just reflect the. Let me give you an example. I was talking to somebody the other day who was telling me that they had this happy childhood, and she said, and all my siblings said my father was really harsh, but I didn't. I knew how to charm him. Now, just let me give you an. What do you make of that? Charming? Who do we charm? There's snake charmers, right? What does it mean to charm a snake? It's to make them not dangerous. Make them behave. It's a way of taming danger. And we become charming. My friend Gordon Neufeld is a brilliant child psychologist. There's certain ways that children will adapt. So if you're not loved for who you are, then you'll become charming. And you'll tame the danger of not being loved by becoming charming. This person was telling me their childhood. They didn't realize it. But as soon as I reflected it back to them, they got it. So sometimes all it takes is take a word that somebody utters. Look at the meaning of it. Oh yeah. I wasn't loved for who I was. I had to charm my father into loving me.
Yeah, like all those emotions that culturally we would deem positive, such as being charming or charismatic, oftentimes are actually a behavioral compensation due to a trauma. But because we think it's admirable or altruistic, it's accepted and something that we don't necessarily have to work with. So can you just speak to how, even though, and especially a lot of times in the entertainment industry and the music industry, people that are big performers, these qualities are admired and put on a pedestal. But underneath that, and we've seen it many times with comedians and actors like Robin Williams, where there is this persona that is accepted, but underneath there is so much deep grief and sadness.
Well, I talk about Williams in the book, and he was a salient example. By the way, I don't know any comedians that wasn't traumatized. I mean, I think it's just part of the. Gilda Radner. I wrote about Gilda Radner. I mean, some of you are too young to remember her, but she was a big star on Saturday Night Live when it first began. She died of ovarian cancer. And incidentally, there was a study that I mentioned in the book, came out of Harvard 3 years ago. Women with severe PTSD have double the risk of ovarian cancer. And if that was the only study ever done, that should have sent every doctor in North America trying to figure out what's the connection between mind and body. And the milder the symptoms of PTSD, the less the risk of ovarian cancer. Like Gilda Radner died of ovarian cancer. And she was a typical ovarian cancer personality. This is what she took on as a child. She suppressed her own needs, always to please others. And she began to make jokes in order to feel closer to her mother. The only way she could feel close to her mom was to make her laugh. And same with Robin Williams. He began to make jokes in order to be closer to her. And he said at some point, isn't that a weird thing to try and make your mother laugh? No, it's not. It's not weird at all. Not when if that's the only way you can get close to her, it's absolutely the brilliant way. And these incredible characters that he made up with his infinite talent for improvisation. You know who they were? They were the only friends he had as a kid. That's why he made them up. So I forget the question, except to say that these talents and then everybody celebrates them for their incredible talent and their charisma, and not realizing that what they're celebrating is the defenses of a helpless child in the hands of an incredible talent. Let me give you a political example. if you read the book, you'll know this, but if you haven't, you won't. What if I told you about a 4-year-old girl who's being bullied by neighborhood kids? And she runs into her house to seek protection from her mother. And the mother says, there is no room for cowards in this house. No, you get out and deal with it. What would you think of that? Would that be parenting that you'd like to celebrate, or would you think that's not what the kid needs? This is Hillary Clinton. This is what's amazing about this story. Not that it happened, but that this story was told on public television, on national television, at the Democratic convention where she was nominated for the presidency. And there was a documentary about her life spoken by God himself, Morgan Freeman. And they told the story as an example of resilience building, strength, character building parenting. And the message was, and this is how I became so strong. And what's being described here is the traumatization of a 4-year-old. You tell a mother orangutan or a mother bear to ignore the fear of their child if their child is being threatened. The message is not that there's no room for cowards in this house, because a 4-year-old kid asking for protection is not a coward. She's a 4-year-old. It's a natural instinct to run to your parent for protection. Any animal will do that. The message is there's no room for your vulnerability in this house. Now you get there and suck it up. The outcome is that during the campaign, when the candidate, now in her 60s, gets pneumonia, do you remember what she did with it? Nothing. Didn't tell anybody until she collapsed with fever and dehydration in the street. Her security detail had to put it into the car because she learned to suck it up. And so when her husband was philandering around, she said, it's my fault. I didn't look after him. Typical trauma reaction. That a woman should go through that in this culture is totally understandable, because that's what women go through. That they should be celebrated on public television and nobody even comments on it. That what's being described here and celebrated here is the traumatization of a 4-year-old. That's incredible. That's how toxic this culture is.
Right, and the danger that it's become so normalized, like you spoke to, that process is not natural, but it's become normal. It's become more than normal. It's become celebrated, like you said, and we see this positively neurotic behavior and what people perceive, and it's become so accepted and widespread throughout Western culture, but Western culture affects the culture everywhere, the whole world. So as we begin to transition into community Q&A, because I'm fortunate enough to have you in the studio tomorrow and we can keep diving deep, but I really am excited to see what's alive within everybody here. There's such a depth to all the topics in which you can go here. And so let's kick it off. Do we have some mics kind of ready? And the invitation here is to feel free to bring it to any topic that is in alignment with what we're speaking to, but then also maybe on the fringes. I'm so...
The only thing I want to say before we go there is,
please.
This is a heavy topic and sometimes a heavy conversation. There's good news in all this. Okay, healing is available. It's just inside all of us, and I think that's both true on the difficult as it seems. It's certainly true on the individual level. I've seen people in the worst kind of emotional and mental states, totally caught up in life-threatening addictions, transform. You've all seen that. So I think it's possible both on the individual and the social level. So I don't want to leave this conversation with sort of we're doomed. We're not doomed. That's the whole point, that we're not doomed. But in order not to doom ourselves, we have to really look at that shadow side of ourselves.
Yeah. And it's just a beautiful invitation and awareness that you shed in the beginning. Right. It's not what happens to us. It's what happens within us. And that's good news because it's within us and we are within us. Exactly. So that means that if there's a thorn in our shoe, we can take it out. But first we have to hold it before we can let it go. Exactly. And the various different healing modalities that, you espouse in the last chapter of the book, through therapy, through psychedelics, the many different modalities allow us to gain access and hold the thorn within us. Right. And then we begin that process to let it go. So is there anything before we do jump into Q&A?
No, I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Okay. All right, great. I'm excited. All right, who's the brave soul who wants to jump first? Sorrel, since you're right here, and then we'll jump back here.
Hello. Thank you for that. That was quite wonderful. I appreciate it. I'm someone that's exploring the idea of becoming a mother. Yeah. And it's petrifying because I don't want to mess it up.
You will. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's the thing. Well, that's partly my question is no matter how much healing you have, it seems like you're still going to mess it up. And also, what could it look like for a society to be as healed as possible and bring the next generations into the world?
So when you say you're petrified, you're very scared, right? Here's how I'm interpreting it. I could be wrong. You tell me, okay? You're not petrified of the future, you're petrified of the past. Stuff happened to you that shouldn't have, or stuff didn't happen that should have. Would that be accurate?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's what you're afraid of transmitting and perpetuating on your children, right?
Yes.
Now, do you mind telling me how old you are?
34.
How old were you when your mother and father took on the job of getting to know themselves so as not to pass on their traumas to you? How old were you when they took that on?
In progress. I think they're starting to. My dad, no. My mum,
how old were you when they started?
I'm 34 and I feel like they may be starting now.
Okay, you're 34 and they're starting now. What would it have meant for you if your mother had asked the same question you just asked me before you were born? What would that have meant for you?
Not being scared to exist in my household?
Yeah. It would have meant everything, yeah? You've already given that gift to your unborn children. You got nothing to worry about. You just keep doing it. Okay? Now, a therapist once said to me that if your parents gave you this much shit and you give your kids this much, you've done a great job. But if you start asking those questions now, you're doing the work already, you read the right books, and there's not that many you need to read, just a couple.
The Myth of Normal available now?
Well, the Myth of Normal, yeah, for sure. There's a lot of that, but I could name some others by others, some by myself, some by others. You're going to be just fine. And one of the things you're going to have to do is to get to trust yourself and your own gut feelings and not take in the message of the culture as to what your kid needs. But I got no worries for your kids. Have one next week. It'll be just fine.
All right, in process. Thank you.